Nichols folded his arms and leant back against the worktop and watched the old demon. He still just looked like a tramp, and had it not been for the call to the Vatican, he would give the man his tea and a bite to eat, then send 51 on his way. He tried to make out what he was saying, but his beard and the strange language made lip reading impossible. The kettle switched itself off as it finished boiling, and Nichols was about to turn to make Macready his sweet tea when the dozen painted squares fluttered as if touched by a light breeze as his hand passed over them, and Nichols could have sworn he could see what looked like a faint heat haze type distortion coming from Macready's downturned palm. It was a nice trick, Nichols thought, but surely that's all it was. Fuck. Macready winced in pain and shook his hand. He blew on his hand and made a couple of fists. You know what the annoying thing is? He said to Nichols. The priest shook his head slightly, still bemused at the magic show. I'm dead, but that still hurts like hell. What's that all about? The question was so genuine and made without even the slightest hint of humor that all Nichols could do was shrug. I'm dead and I can still feel pain, Macready continued. That's one thing I never got. I get hungry, but I'm pretty sure I can't starve to death. I've been shot, stabbed, you name it, down through the years. Yet I can't die, not by the conventional ways anyhow. So what's the point of the whole pain thing? Macready stared off into space, clearly perplexed by his condition. You're asking me? Nichols replied, even though the question was clearly rhetorical. Macready's voice was so weary all of a sudden, almost melancholy, that Nichols suddenly felt sorry for the old man, because in the end that's all he could see him as, not some demon from the pit, some collector of souls. Just a weary old man who had had enough of what Cardinal Santini had called the Great Fight. Nichols tore himself away and made Macready his tea. He put in the 4 sugars, gave it a good stir, then placed the mug down on the table in front of the old man. Thanks, he said softly, and gathered up the pieces of paper into a loose pile. He took a sip of the tea and nodded appreciatively. Perfect. Tea and sympathy, Nichols said. The British way. I've missed it. Macready smiled ruefully and took another sip. This time he smacked his lips. What are you? The question escaped Nichols' lips before he even thought about asking it. 52. What am I, truthfully? Macready leant back in his chair and folded his arms. He looked off into space for several seconds thinking, then finally turned to the priest. I'm tired, he said plainly. Cardinal Santini called you a demon. Macready let out a little laugh at this. It's a little more complicated than that, Father. He leaned forwards again and collected all the pieces of paper together, then began shuffling them like they were playing cards, all except one which he left face down on the table. But no, I'm not a demon. I was a man, once, just like you, only without the faith. I wasn't made, as much as I was. He paused, thinking of the right words. As I was recruited, years ago now. By the devil? Nichols asked. Again he couldn't believe what he was saying. Fuck knows, Macready shrugged. It's all a game, you see? Your side, my side. One long never-ending, pointless game. They don't want mindless robots, they have real demons for that. I was picked because I had a natural aptitude for causing mischief, that's all. And now you've had enough? The old man nodded. I just can't do this anymore. He frowned and chewed on his lower lip. Christ, the shit I've done. Nichols watched his grubby hands absently handling the papers. The young priest watched him lost in thought for a full minute. Although he was loath to break the spell, he finally said, the cardinal called you a defector. Said you wanted to come over to our side. Whatever our side actually meant. Out of nowhere tears came to Macready's eyes, but his voice remained steady. I'm a traitor, he said flatly and looked up at Nichols, but the sorrow in them made the priest look away instantly. Nichols studied his feet as Macready continued. In the end that's all I am. Just a traitor to my own kind. It's just. Now his voice cracked with emotion slightly, he paused trying to keep his tone level. I just want it all to end. If someone doesn't do something it's all just going to go on and on forever. Nichols chanced to look up to see Macready staring at the papers in his hands. I've spilt enough blood over the years to drown an army, Father. He exhaled and placed the papers in a pile on the table in front of him, then after a moment added. And I won't spill any more. Cardinal Santini had warned Nichols that what he had called the agents of darkness, Nichols had mused that they always seemed to have such colorful titles, these bad guys, would stop at nothing to prevent Macready's defection. Not that Santini could offer him any means of defense against them if they did come. Just hope we get to you before they do, was all he would say. And trust Macready. Trust a demon? Thanks for nothing. So what are those things for? Nichols gestured to the pile of paper. There are those out there who will do anything to stop me doing this. He picked up one of the pieces of paper, The crude drawing on it put Nichols in mind of a malformed dog. These will help hide my presence, for a while at least. That's the theory anyway. You don't sound too confident. Nichols had to admit he was hoping for something a little more solid. A machine gun would have been nice. The old man shrugged. I'm not. But this is all I've got. I've lost so much power, since breaking away. He frowned, lost in thought again, then came back with a shrug a moment later. We'll see, I guess. I just hope your lot get here before I'm detected. The sooner I'm in the Vatican, the sooner I'm safe. He stopped and thought about this. Christ, safe, he added with a shake of the head. He selected 2 of the papers and held them out to Nichols. Take these, pin them to the church doors out the front, I'll place the rest. Nichols looked at the papers but didn't move. You don't believe in any of this, do you? MacReady asked, still holding out the charms. What, that you're a demon? A collector of souls? Gee, let me think. Nichols was unable to mask his sarcastic tone. I thought you Catholics were all about the blind faith? MacReady asked with a lopsided grin. 54 Everything has its limits, Nichols said, but took the 2 pieces of paper all the same. He studied the designs. One was the deformed dog thing, the other looked like a crudely drawn padlock. That'll stop anything, shall we say unnatural, getting in and soiling this precious church of yours. MacReady offered. But I tell you what, if anything does get in, you turn the other cheek, see where that gets you. Here's what you do, put those 2 on the church's door like I said. He then selected 4 more, which Nichols took obediently. These others go on each of the walls out there, doesn't matter which one on which wall. They will stop anything coming through the windows. He smiled. Collectors just love fucking up stained glass windows. I should know, I've raised a few churches in my time. He looked at Nichols as if expecting a response to this, but the priest wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He just looked back with a bored expression on his face. What about this miner's poem thing, the cardinal told me about? Nichols asked, and noted with no little glee that at mention of the words miner's poem the smile fell right off MacReady's grubby face. Fuck no, MacReady said sharply and physically shuddered. The less you know about that thing the better. He fumbled with the other papers, but Nichols could see he had left one face down on the table. I'll place these, around here, MacReady nodded around the room. What about that one? Nichols gestured to the face down paper he had left on the table. MacReady took the spoon out of the empty cereal bowl and used it to slide the piece of paper across the table to Nichols, who reached out a hand but hesitated in picking it up. It's okay, you can touch it. MacReady pushed it a little closer with the spoon. You sure? Nichols asked, more than a little suspicious. That's your last line of defense, Father. MacReady tapped the paper with the spoon. If it touches anything tainted, for want of a better word, something like me, another collector, or something we have created. Attack demon, attack demon. The words rolled off his tongue so effortlessly, that kind of thing. It will burn them up like fucking napalm, and believe me, I know, I've been on the wrong end of one of those bastards. He shuddered. Again, but this time theatrically. Burns for hours, if it's a collector. It should kill a demon outright, but that depends who's created it. Nichols gingerly picked up the piece of paper and turned it over to reveal the picture of a flaming eye. He slipped it into his pocket. And are we expecting to see any of these attack demons running around my church? Nichols didn't believe a word of any of this, but still felt strangely comforted by the charm. He patted his pocket, which won a grin from MacReady. To be honest, the only drawback to one of those is the fact that if you get close enough to use it, you're already as good as dead. He paused, watching Nichols. Whether you believe in any of this shit or not. MacReady got to his feet and arched his back, which cracked alarmingly. Oof, he winced. Better get to it, Father. He picked up his mug of tea and held it up in a toast. Here's to a quiet night, and your continued ignorance to the real world. I'll drink to that, Nichols said, turning towards the door. But you'll place the papers? MacReady asked behind him. I'm quite happy to humor you. Nichols turned to look at him. If it'll make you feel better. It will, and admit it, it can't hurt. He raised his eyebrows, then added, and it'll make you feel better too. Never, thought Nichols, and left the unlikely demon without replying. 9 If Father Nichols had known then that would be the last time he would ever speak to MacReady, he would have thought of some witty parting shot, or at the very least asked him why, of all the churches in this city, he had chosen to wander into his, and as a result right royally mess his life up forever. As he walked down the long stone corridor which led from his living quarters to the church itself, Nichols turned the paper charms over in his hands. He hadn't noticed before, but whatever enchantment MacReady had 56 placed on it had made the texture of the paper somehow denser. It felt almost like leather now, and he wasn't sure if it was just the meager light in here, but the blood symbols on them looked quite black against the white. He wanted to put this all down to cheap parlor tricks, but the more he tried to rationalize the night's events as they were unfolding, Macready's arrive at his vestry door ranting about sanctuary, and of course not forgetting the bordering on comical Vatican phone call and Macready's sleight of hand show in the kitchen. The more he found it hard to do so. Sure, he could tell himself this was all nonsense, to just play along until the cavalry arrived and whisked Macready, demon or not, off out of his live forever. But there was something lurking at the back of his mind telling him that no matter how outlandish all this was, it somehow rung true. Maybe I am losing his marbles after all, Nichols thought to himself as he reached the heavy oak door which led through to the back of the church. He turned the iron door handle and stepped through into the church. Although it was mid-September, the church felt much colder than normal. Nichols reached to turn on the overhead lights but decided against it. He liked the way the church looked at night, and there was more than enough light coming through the stained glass windows from the street outside to see what he was doing. He made his way through the back pews and over to the right-hand side wall. He selected one of the papers and was about to pin it to the stone when he realized he didn't have any means of doing so. "Damn it," he whispered and was surprised to see his breath in the air. Maybe it was colder tonight than he had thought. The paper bristled in his hand for a moment as if it were alive, which was more than a little unnerving. "Okay." Nichols held out the paper and touched it against the wall. The instant it touched the stone it seemed to spark as if electrified. Nichols cursed and pulled his hand away and was only half surprised to see that it stuck there all by itself. He rubbed his hand. It hadn't hurt, but there was no denying that he had felt a surge of power run up his arm which made the hairs on it stand up on end. The air around him felt almost oppressive, like a thunderstorm was brewing, and he caught the slight smell of static. "Just till morning," Nichols told himself out loud. He screwed his eyes tight shut. "Come on," he scolded and opened his eyes again. He looked 57 around the church. Was it him or was it darker than when he had first walked in? Normally when your eyes become accustomed to the gloom you can see better, but in the few short seconds his eyes had been closed the reverse had happened. No. Nichols dismissed the notion and let out a short sharp cleansing breath which once again misted in the air in front of him. But he still couldn't dismiss the growing fear that was welling up in the pit of his stomach. The church just looked wrong somehow. The shadows misplaced the air oppressive, and it was damn near freezing now, far too cold to be natural for this time of year. The priest uttered a short prayer to himself and did his best to push thoughts of magic out of his head. He moved away from the charm and put his mind to placing the rest of the charms so he could get out of here and back to the relative comfort of his living quarters. As with the first, each of the others stuck to the walls as if magnetized to something deep within the stone and gave off a spark of power, and by the time Nichols had placed the last of the charms on the double doors at the front of the church the air around him was fair crackling with power, and he didn't like the way it felt. He stepped away from the doors and backed into the church. As he had been placing the charms, the fear in his belly had mixed with that of shame. This was supposed to be a place of God, and he was defiling it with this unholy dark magic. He took a step back towards the charms on the door, suddenly wanting to tear them down, but managed to catch himself before he did. Like it or not, he needed them, just for a few more hours, and then he would take great pleasure in ripping them to pieces and burning them. But still he couldn't shake the feeling that if this was all some grand test of his faith in God, then he would have surely failed it. Turning so quickly as he had to this. Witchcraft? The word stung his conscience, because behind all the mumbo-jumbo and sleight of hand, that's all this really was, the devil's work. Not only had he himself let that demon into his church, but had actively taken part in this abomination. Nichols had never felt so ashamed in all his life. He knew this was so wrong, felt it in every fiber of his being, but worst of all, he couldn't bring himself to stop any of it, and even worse still, he couldn't deny that now that the charms were up and he could feel their power in the air around him, he 58 felt physically safer now that they were up and keeping whatever may come knocking at the door at bay. He trusted in their magic, and it made him sick to his stomach. He rummaged in his pockets and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes and his trusty old Zippo lighter. Thinking that maybe a hit of nicotine would calm his frayed nerves a little, he pulled out a cigarette using his teeth and lit it. He took a deep pull, letting the smoke fill his lungs. Over the past few months, Nichols had gradually been cutting down on the amount he had been smoking and was down to just 2 or 3 a day. 4 on Sundays if performance anxiety got the better of him. So the nicotine made him pleasantly lightheaded, and he tilted back his head and blew the smoke up into the air, watching it drift upwards, caught in the street light streaming through a nearby stained glass window. "Better," he said, and took another drag before putting the packet back into his pocket along with the Zippo. He glanced around the church at each of the paper charms in turn and shook his head. A couple of 100 years ago they would have burnt you at the stake for less than this. He chuckled at the thought, and feeling a little better thanks to the nicotine coursing through his weary system, started to make his way down the aisle and over to the back of the church. Nichols looked up at the life-size statue of the Virgin Mary which stood on a plinth close to the back door near the confessionals, and as he passed it he instinctively tapped one of its stone feet for luck.